As some of you know, my son has got a PhD in literature, and when he announced to us that he was going to do his master's degree and his PhD in literature, I said, well, that's the second most useless degree in the world. Right up there with a PhD in philosophy, just bound to mess up your head. And but he's done a lot of work with that degree in literature in terms of writing about the importance of story and talking about the importance of story in our culture, and how, in fact, we were not an illiterate people. That's what his PhD dissertation was about, that we were not an illiterate people. And the work that he has done, in fact, started with the review of some of the writings of Peter Jones, about whom you've heard a bit here tonight. That was part of his master's thesis. But from that, he went on to talk about, in fact, what our sources of literacy were. And he has written about, in fact, the belts that you have had an opportunity to witness here tonight, on how the belts, in fact, were used as sources of speech for our people, and that when they were brought out, the belts would be read to the people. So if I'd known that Alan was going to read 4 speeches, or 5 was it, I might have brought a longer speech. But actually, I haven't brought any speech. I just came here in order to talk with you about what it is that I see we are going to have to consider when it comes to the issue of the Royal Proclamation, 1763. I had an opportunity recently to do a presentation on that question for the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. And the paper I wrote was entitled, My Love-Hate Relationship with the Royal Proclamation. And you understand now, I think, a little bit about why that is so from what it is that you've heard here tonight. That in fact, the Royal Proclamation has been said to be the Bill of Rights or the Magna Carta for the Indian people in North America. It is a declaration which recognizes the right to exist and the right to be self-governing within our territories, and that it was a promise that was made by the King of England in 1763 that recognized, in fact, the sovereignty of the Indian nations that are identified in the treaty and in the proclamation, and I think arguably recognized for all Indian nations in North America. We need to understand that the Royal Proclamation was issued after the war between the French and the English, and after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and after a whole bunch of very important historical incidents that occurred in which the power and the right of the Indian nations of North America played a very significant role, and in fact were highly sought after by those who were involved in that conflict at the time. And the role of the Aboriginal people at that time in resolving that conflict, or assisting in the resolution of that conflict, and in how that conflict all ended, was known far and wide by all of those who were in charge. And the Royal Proclamation was a recognition that Aboriginal people, Indian nations, First Nations as we now call them, were not to be trifled with, that they were to be respected, and that their rights to their territory and their right to take care of themselves within their own territory was not to be interfered with. And the declaration by the Crown at the time was that nobody, no colonial entity, no private individual, nobody could interfere with the Indian nations within their territories. And that declaration seems to have been made very clearly. But why I came to hate the Royal Proclamation was that it defended us against nothing, that it was not, in fact, a shield, and it was, in fact, used by the governments of this country and the United States and England since then as a vehicle, as a means by which they could interfere with First Nations, with their territorial rights. Because if you think about what the Royal Proclamation was, it was in fact an assumption of sovereignty over Indian territory by the Crown. The Royal Proclamation in and of itself is a declaration by the King of England that I am now the one that they must deal with for their territory. I am now the one who will be their protector. I am now the one who is the only one that they can deal with. So it was, in effect, a very arrogant, self-centered, selfish assumption of power on the part of the sovereign of England. So that's why I hate it. But that's also why it's important. It's important because of the recognition it gives, but it's also important because of the recognition it has taken away. And the recognition it took away was the rights of Indigenous nations to make their own determinations about who they were going to deal with. They had that right inherently before the Royal Proclamation, and they probably still had it afterwards to the extent that they could enforce it. But it became almost impossible to enforce it because the Treaty of Paris, which resolved the world war that had occurred between France and England and Spain and Portugal, became a source of a conspiracy amongst all the other nations of the world that those other three would not deal with the Indian nations in North America, that they would take a hands-off approach. So almost by omission, the First Nations of North America had nobody else that they could deal with when it came to negotiating any relationship other than with the Crown and Right of England, because all of the other world powers backed away. France and Spain and Portugal all agreed through the Treaty of Paris that they would recognize British sovereignty in North America. That, of course, became challenged by the Americans subsequently in their War of Independence in 1776. But that aside, the relationship became a limitation upon First Nations people. But it did provide that opportunity, at least, for First Nations to be able to assert their own internal sovereignty, to be assured, because the Declaration promised that there would be no interference in their internal operation. And one of the weaknesses that others have said exists with the Royal Proclamation was that the wording of it and the negotiation of the wording of it did not involve Indian leaders at the time. They were not engaged in the process of the proclamation itself, and that's true. Royal proclamations are documents that are prepared by the government and issued by the king with the assistance of his ministers. So technically, it wasn't a treaty because it was not negotiated. The terms of it were not negotiated with the First Nation leaders in North America at the time. But it became something different because of Sir William Johnson, about whom we have heard. Because in the fall of 1763, after the Royal Proclamation had been issued on October the 7th, he invited all of the Indian leaders of the Great Lakes area to come to a gathering in order to talk about the Royal Proclamation. And he sent copies of the Royal Proclamation to all of the leaders in all of those territories to invite them to this gathering. And the historical evidence shows that, in fact, over 2,000 of them subsequently gathered with him at Niagara in 1764. And at that time, in that place, he had the proclamation read to them in their languages and explained to them in their languages so that they understood what the Royal Proclamation said. And then he promised them, through the issuance of those wampum belts about which we have heard so much tonight, he promised them that the terms of the Royal Proclamation would now become the basis of the relationship between Indian nations in North America and the Crown. And it was important that he do that because of Pontiac, because of what Pontiac showed Indian people were capable of if the Crown did not respect their territory. And because of that warning that he had issued to them, and because of their fear that if the Indian nations ever did come together and unite, as Pontiac had wanted all Indian nations to do, to drive out the Englishmen, to drive out the white people, because they were afraid of that, they needed Indian people to accept the Royal Proclamation as the basis of that relationship. And so they did. And those wampum belts, particularly the two-row wampum that you have heard about, the friendship belts that have been discussed here, were revealed and were shared at that time with all of the leadership. And some of those leaders had traveled for months. Some came from as far away as Hudson Bay, from as far west as the Mississippi, and from as far east as the Maritimes. Mi'kmaq people were represented, we were told, at those discussions at Niagara. And those discussions went on for weeks and weeks. And it was through that discussion and those issuances of those wampum belts and those assurances that were given that the promises were made by the Indian nations that they would not engage in war against the Crown, and that they would recognize the ability of the Crown to act as they wished to act under the Royal Proclamation. So they would recognize the importance of that document. And so it became incorporated into what has been referred to as the Treaty of Niagara. The Treaty of Niagara technically is not a land surrender treaty, so therefore it doesn't get the recognition that most other treaties do. It is a treaty of friendship and peace. As Sir William Johnson referred to it, a treaty of offense and defense. A treaty in which you agree that you will be our allies and we agree that we will be yours, and that we will defend each other. And it was understood that those agreements, those treaties, those belts would be brought out every year to be reminders to all of the people and all of the subsequent leadership of that relationship. But they weren't. They were for a while, but it quickly disappeared. So that by the time of the War of 1812, the opportunity for those celebrations had dropped by the wayside. And we don't see those meetings and those dialogues occurring much anymore. And by the time of Confederation in Canada in 1867, you never hear about those things happening. There was a reference here to a reminder that was issued by the chiefs of the Ojibwe people. Reminder to the English authorities, you have forgotten about that relationship that we formed 100 years ago. And yet, that reminder did nothing to bring things back to a head. But there are provisions within the British North America Act that serve as a connection to the Royal Proclamation. The fact, for example, that Indians and lands reserved for Indians are under the federal jurisdiction and that provinces have no control, technically, over Indians and lands reserved for Indians is a reflection of the same assurance that was in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And the fact that the treaties that were entered into following Confederation in Western Canada were treaties that were negotiated in the same basis as had been promised in the Royal Proclamation were all reminiscent of those assurances and those processes that were enunciated in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So it did become the vehicle by which the Crown exercised its authority to take lands away, because it said, you can only give your lands to us, and we are the only ones who can take your lands from you. And after Confederation, they proceeded to take the lands away. And even after a while, they gave up on the treaty process and just took the lands away anyway. So as I say, the Royal Proclamation, as a Bill of Rights, as a protection, served no protection whatsoever. And it was because, I think, everybody who was in a position of importance on the side of the Crown simply forgot, conveniently perhaps, but simply forgot about the Royal Proclamation and the importance of it. Such that, in fact, when you talked about it at the time I was in law school, in those ancient days when dinosaurs still roamed the earth, as my granddaughter asked me one day, "Did you ever get chased by a dinosaur?" That's what she And my answer, incidentally, as I was telling Sakej, my answer was, no, I always turned and fought them. So I was still a hero in her eyes. An old hero, but still a hero. But at the time that I was in law school, when we were studying the Royal Proclamation, the study of the Royal Proclamation lasted about 3.5 minutes, if that. It was only a passing reference to the fact that this proclamation existed at one time. It may have changed since, but this isn't that long ago. This is within my lifetime. This was 34 years ago that we were studying it in that way. But what we need to remember is that not only was I studying it in that way, but every single person who went through law school before me, since Confederation, and even after me, also received the same degree of attention to it. Every single lawyer who worked for the Government of Canada was taught that much or that little about the Royal Proclamation. Every single judge in Canada received that kind of minimal education about the Royal Proclamation. And in the early cases that deal with the issue of Indian title, that deal with the issue of Aboriginal rights, in our courts and in the legal briefs that are filed, not only by the Crown, in whose interest such an argument was important, but also on behalf of the First Nations, many of those briefs, in fact, misargue the importance of the Royal Proclamation. And it's because people were coming to the issue from a position of ignorance, lack of knowledge, not a negative position in the sense of deliberately trying to mislead people. But they were coming at it because no one had taught them differently. And now, in this day and age, we are learning about things differently. Each and every opportunity that we have within our community today, we have academics and intellects and students and professors and professionals like you who are lifting up the leaves to look underneath to see what's there. And that's important that we do that we continue to do that for ourselves, to inform ourselves about the rightness of what it is that our elders are saying. For the longest time, we were unable to believe in our own elders. We were unable to believe in what they were telling us because we had been taught in law school that belief required certain levels and kinds and ways of proof. And we just didn't have those levels and ways and kinds of proof in front of us. We had been misinformed as well as lawyers. And now our eyes are being opened, our way is being shown, and we are now beginning to use those skills to influence others, to say, now just wait a minute. All that you have been doing has been because you did not know any better. And to be fair to those people, we cannot hate them because they didn't know any better. We can only hate them if they continue to do the wrong thing now that they know better. But we still have a long way to go to open their eyes as well. And understand this, it was a deliberate process of misinformation that occurred. And with the work that I'm now engaged in with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it is clear that they were intending to take children away from their families and place them in institutions for the purpose of removing them from their culture, from their language, and from their identity. But it was also to prevent that transfer of knowledge that takes place from community to child. It's so important. You've all heard the expression, it takes a village to raise a child. And it's because we know that parents, and you'll learn this quickly, those of you who are going to have children, because those of us who have children have been reminded of it, we don't know anything as parents. And it's because of that that we need the aunties and the uncles, and we need the grandmothers and the grandfathers, and we need the elders in our community, and we need our leaders to be saying to our children the same things that we say to them as parents, so that it reinforces what it is that we want our children to know. That's why the village is so important to the education of our children. But with residential schools, what they did was they took the children away from the families, and they took them away from their villages and placed them in these institutions so that they could put them into a closed environment of indoctrination into a different way of thinking. But if they had only done that, it might have been salvageable, because then the children could have returned to those villages and the villages could have given them back that knowledge. But then the government and the churches and society proceeded to destroy the villages, because through legislation the leadership was undermined, ceremonies were prohibited and were outlawed. Just being an Indian turned you into a non-person, took away the right to vote so that you couldn't vote those people out of office who were doing those kinds of things. You couldn't hire lawyers to challenge those laws because you were legally prevented from hiring lawyers. And you couldn't sue the government unless they gave you permission to sue them. And nobody ever got permission to sue them. And you couldn't protest even. It became a conspiracy against the law if 3 or more Indians gathered in a place to discuss their grievances against the Crown. So all of the means by which the villages could be maintained were taken away from the parents who were left behind. And as a result, when the children came out of the schools, they were returned to communities that each generation was less and less capable of giving them this kind of knowledge. I'm not surprised to hear that those belts are not in the hands of the people to whom they were entrusted, and they are in museums and other places, because it was illegal to hang on to them. It was illegal to try to keep them. It was illegal to bring them out to talk about them from 1874 on. And as a result of that, some of those things simply went underground and people would do them in hidden places. I can remember the first time I ever went to a sweat lodge back in the 1970s. The elder, we drove to his house, he put us in his truck, and there were about 6 of us in the back of his pickup truck. And then he drove down this gravel road, and he drove off the end of the gravel road, through a ditch and through a field and through a bush and up a hill and over the hill and across a creek. Drove for miles and miles way off into the bush. And here we are all bouncing around in the back, you know. And we're all saying, why is he going away so far? It's because we used to have to hide in order to do that. All of you know these kinds of things. You can talk about that. Maybe some of you young people don't know that. We used to have to hide just to do those kinds of things. Whenever I go to schools now, we always have elders come in and do a prayer, or there may be a drum group that comes in and sings a song for the students. And the students are shocked if I say to them, if you had done this, if your grandfather had done this when he was a little boy, he could have got into trouble, because it was illegal to sit around a drum. It was illegal to dress up like Indians. Wearing Indian garb was an offense under the Indian Act. I'm still not sure what Indian garb means and so on. maybe just wearing a loincloth, which should be illegal in particularly in Canada, when it's freezing. But everything and anything relating to our culture and our sense of identity was rendered illegal. And as a result of that, the capacity of our villages to give that knowledge and to give that sense of identity and to give that sense of pride to our children was taken away from them. And so this knowledge that has been shared with us about the Royal Proclamation and the belts and what the belts mean and the mere existence of the belts was something that was prohibited for so long. I was looking at this canoe. The Royal Proclamation is written on the side of that canoe. Be sure you read it before you go, so you can see, in fact, now it's different today. But what makes it different today is not just that we can do it if we want, but it's that we have to do it, and we can do it, so we should. And my granddaughter, who still thinks that I was chased by dinosaurs, she knows all there is to know about our creation story. Those of you who are students today know that I talked about how important that is. She knows about our creation story. She knows about her grandfather and where her grandfather came from. She knows about our people and where our people came from. She knows all of those things, and she's prepared to stand up and talk about them. She was at the Manitoba Museum one day. And if you ever go to the Manitoba Museum, you'll see a big mural. It's about 30 feet wide. And inside this mural, there's a pictograph of an Indian on a horseback about to shoot a buffalo. And the fellow who was leading all of these little children, she was in her class, all of these little children were being led through this. And the museum guide said, "This is a picture of an Aboriginal man about to shoot a buffalo with a bow and arrow," he said. "There used to be Aboriginal people here who did that." That's what he said. At which point, my granddaughter put up her hand and said, "Excuse me, but I'm Aboriginal and I'm still here." 6 years old. All of our children should not be hesitating to do that. They should all feel the importance that we are entitled to feel about who we are. And so I just wish she could have seen this, to know that this is still here. Not only that, but she could have heard this talk. Now that you have borne witness to it, your responsibility is to carry this message and to talk about this. Don't keep this to yourself. You tell everybody that you know that those belts still exist and they're still brought out, and there are still people like this man who can talk about them. And we need to bring them out all the time, because that's what was meant to be. Our belief at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is that if we are going to have a process of reconciliation, it must be founded on the mutual respect that was initially promised to the Indigenous nations of this part of the world. And that mutual respect is reflected in the Royal Proclamation. And that's why I love it. That's why I love it, because the mutual respect is reflected in that document. And we must return to that position of mutual respect, and we must make sure that every single child in the public school system is taught about that mutual respect, in order that we can move forward together, all of us, to ensure that we find out what our future together is going to be like, in order to reduce our conflict, hopefully, but at least find a way to resolve the conflicts more easily than we are doing at this point in time. So thank you for letting me be part of this day. I appreciate being invited here and being part of your evening. I appreciate as well how important this is to all of you. And I wish you all well in your endeavors. And thank the leadership, Chief, for letting me be part of of this day, and also for inviting me and letting me be part of your territory for this period of time. Miigwech.